Okay, fourth and final class. So welcome everybody. Today I want to do two things. One, continue on in our survey of Zionistic opinions. And second, I wanted to do a sort of broad overview through a series of case studies that I think will highlight the tension that I've been trying to highlight throughout. And these are going to be three or four different Israeli Supreme Court cases about the question of who is a Jew and how the tension of whether or not Zionism is seen as a continuity of Jewish tradition or a severance from Jewish tradition is at full display in these debates over who's a Jew, who gets to decide, do we have a religious definition or a national definition? What does this even mean? So we'll get to that in about 30 or 40 minutes. But one of the things, I think I sent this out in the email earlier this week, one area that I often find American Jews to be most confused about or surprised about is the debate about Zionism within the Orthodox world. The vast majority of American Jews do not identify as Orthodox, and the Orthodox Jews that American Jews tend to come into contact with do not necessarily represent the mainstream Orthodox view. In other words, I started this class out, we started 3 Thursdays ago, and I put a Times of Israel article that said 250,000 ultra-Orthodox Jews protesting being drafted to the IDF. And that is a massive number. That, the Jewish population of Israel is only about 7 to 8 million, depending on, again, who exactly you count as a Jew. So we're talking about massive percentage, 4 or 5% of the country who identify as ultra-Orthodox and do not want to serve in the IDF so much so that they're willing to spend their day protesting in Jerusalem. And so we'll get to a little bit of that, and I think that'll be interesting. But I wanted to let me share my screen, and I'll kind of give the main question for today. This question is a little bit more austere than our other questions, but the wider question that the Orthodox world, and Orthodox, I'm not defining that too narrowly. The traditional Jewish world. So the same debate takes place in, much of the conservative Jewish world, right? It took place in the 20th century. The same debate took place in some of the Mizrahi, the non-Ashkenazi Jewish world. So we'll talk about a little bit that nuance in a second. But for now, I'm talking about late 1800s, early 1900s, pre-state. Is Zionism a religious value in Judaism, right? And like all good questions like this, the answer is obviously not going to be able to be black and white. But let me give a couple of bullet points. I'm going to guess everybody knows everything I'm about to put on this slide, but I just want to, contain and bound our conversation with some obvious facts. And these are the facts that the ultra-Orthodox community, the Orthodox community was dealing with when this new movement called Zionism, and especially political Zionism, came onto the table. So one, and this was our entire first class, Zion in Judaism is an old idea, right? We find it in the Tanakh, we find it in the Talmud, we find it in medieval writings, and Zion has always been associated with Messianic longing. And so, again, 3 sessions ago, I gave the thought experiment that if you go back in time and talk to your great-great-great-grandparent who was living in the 1600s and you tell them there is now a Jewish state, they would think that that necessarily means the Messiah had come. They would not understand a Jewish return to the land of Israel, Jewish political self-determination without the Messiah, right? This was seen as something that was beyond the realm of possibility of what can happen. And so this is one fact to keep in mind. The second is that it's pretty clear, right? It was clear in the 1800s, and it seems clear now in the year 2025 that for the cohort of Jews who believe in a messianic redemption, that the Messiah has not yet come, right? So we are still, right, from the contemporary Orthodox perspective, we are still in that period of pre-Messianic times. The third is that political Zionists were secular, and most of them viewed their project as a break from Jewish tradition. This is what we talked about 2 weeks ago, right? People like Moshe Hess and Herzl and many of the other early political Zionists did not view and couch what they were doing in traditional Jewish language. They were not talking about a return to the land of Israel to foster, Jewish spirituality and connectivity with the land. They were talking in the language of secularity and universal rights and nationalism and, questions of, even today when we talk about, does Israel have a right to exist? Do Jews have a right to self-determination? this is a very secular conversation that we're having, right? These are contemporary, post-Enlightenment, post-emancipation terms. And so these are not terms that the mainstream Orthodox Jewish community are engaged with. This is not how the Orthodox Jewish community thinks. They don't think in terms of rights to self-determination and political autonomy. And so, right, this is our third fact. Our fourth fact, which is going to be, I think, the most interesting one, is that Zionism, at least in its goal of the creation of a state and its secondary goal of creating a state that generally is going to prevent something like another Kishinev pogrom or, of course, the Holocaust, was generally successful in keeping Jews safe. We can quibble with the full extent of that remarks a little bit, because as Zionism seemed, especially when, things like October 7th happens, there's actually an interesting conversation in the Orthodox community of whether or not Zionism still is theologically tenable. We'll get to that in about 20 minutes. It's a very interesting conversation. So these are the four facts to sort of throw on the board that the Orthodox community is dealing with. So there's two main responses. This is going to seem a little bit simple, and then we'll make it a little bit more complex. There were two dominant Orthodox responses pre-state. So again, you drop into 1905, any traditional Jewish community. Again, we're mostly talking about the Ashkenazi Orthodox world here. And there were two main reactions. The mainstream Orthodox opinion, this was the majority by any account, right? I don't want to give an exact number because they didn't exactly have a good Pew polling back then. But if you were around in the year 1900, if you were Orthodox, it was almost certain you were not a Zionist. And if you were a Zionist, it was almost certain you were not Orthodox. And again, this is because of everything we've talked about the last couple of weeks, right? Zionism has at least part of it as attempting to break away from the dominant Orthodox modality, which is, as we discussed, was we have to wait for the Messiah, and maybe there's value in exile, there's value in the diaspora, and it's only for God to bring us back to the land of Israel. And this is true in both halves of the Orthodox community. This is, I always like to say, this is the biggest debate that nobody has ever heard of, right, outside of the Orthodox world. The Orthodox world, still today, but more so in the 17 and 1800s, was quite literally torn in half between two different movements. You can still see many relics of this debate today in the Orthodox community, especially in Israel, between the Litvak world and the Hasidic world. This was before the Enlightenment. This almost destroyed, tore Ashkenazi Judaism in half. Just to give the brief history, because I think it's really interesting, and especially interesting when discussing Zionism. There was a man named Meir Baal Shem Tov in the early 1700s, and he began to go around Eastern Europe and preach about how the Judaism of this time was becoming overly stale, overly hierarchical. It was just a bunch of rabbis who were interested in, ever shrinking minutia of law. And he started spreading, what many scholars consider a populist movement of saying we need to breathe life back into Judaism. We need to bring back the singing and the dancing, maybe some drinking, right? And Judaism's not all about, increasingly narrow legalese, right? It's not only about, Talmud study, and became this movement called the Hasidic movement that quickly spread throughout Eastern Europe. Many of the rabbinic leaders at the time viewed this as a threat to both their way of life and their hegemony, right, over the Jewish community. And so the leaders of the Orthodox world, right, then it was basically all Orthodox if we're talking about Central or Eastern Europe, the Vilna Gaon, right, who was the head rabbi of Lithuania, excommunicated Meir Baal Shem Tov, or the Baal Shem Tov, right? Litvak literally means from Lithuania. And rather than him be excommunicated, he had enough of a following to essentially, his followers obviously rejected the excommunication. And this started a break in the Jewish world that would span for hundreds of years. So still today, if you're in the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, right, from a, liberal American perspective, it seems like, ultra-Orthodox are all kind of the same, right? They all wear hats. They're all very religious. They're all very, conservative in terms of their social mores. But there's a huge difference still today between the Hasidic and Litvak world. And both of those worlds reject Zionism, right? So they both come to the forefront and agree that they want to reject Zionism, mostly because it's too secular, right? We'll get into some further reason in a second, but essentially, there were all of these different movements that were the Jewish response to modernity, right? We discussed this a little bit in the first class. There was, once the, ghetto walls were open, the metaphoric ghetto walls, Jews were offered a chance to assimilate into European culture in exchange for Judaism. And so you have groups like the Reform movement, we spoke about that, who said, well, if we can only change Jewish identity enough that Jews can seem more German-like, that's great. Obviously, the Orthodox community rejects reform because they are changing things. Then you had other groups, the Bund, who adopted socialism and communism because they said, well, if we can only fix class struggle, then anti-Semitism will fall by the wayside. Obviously, socialism and communism do not fit very well with a strict Orthodox theology, so Orthodox Jews reject that. And Zionism was the same thing, right? Zionism said, well, if we could only change the way that most people see Judaism to a nationalist movement, and a nationalist movement that is not, a bunch of people sitting around waiting for the Messiah to come, then Jews will be safe. And of course, the Orthodox community rejects that too. And so the Orthodox community viewed Zionism, and again, this is still talking about the year 1900. Things get more complicated once Israel is founded. We'll discuss that in a few minutes. But from the vantage point of the early 1900s, the Orthodox community viewed Zionism the exact same way they viewed the Reform movement and the Bund and all these movements. It was something that's modern, something that's secular, and something that, they don't want to have, any piece of it. Not to mention that many Zionist groups, this is sort of an interesting history of Eastern Europe, many Zionist groups, especially in Eastern Europe, so places like Russia and Ukraine, were attempting to do their, the most that they could to recruit, especially young men, to the Zionist movement. And oftentimes there were covert recruitment centers that they had Zionists enroll in Orthodox yeshivot, and they weren't really there to study Talmud. They were actually there to, kind of whisper to their friends in the hallway, hey, leave the yeshiva, leave the Orthodox world, and come with us to, be pioneers. So this is a fascinating episode of history between the Orthodox world and Zionism. And the last reason, and this is something we discussed the first class, there was this idea of, again, forcing the end, of forcing the Messiah to come, this big meta debate within Jewish sources about whether or not the Messianic process has to be passive, or whether or not we can actually, in some way, what's called in Hasidic literature, force the end. Can you actually bring about the Messianic process by action, or does it have to be all about, prayer and faith and waiting? There's one more issue that this is, always of endless confusion to anybody who's not in the ultra-Orthodox world. So I want to highlight this just because this is probably something people might have seen, but not something that I feel like people often engage with, especially outside of a Orthodox context. The Talmud, so again, circa, let's say 400 CE in Babylonia, has a very famous passage. It's in Tractate Ketubot, where they say that when the Jews went into exile, there were 3 oaths that were made between the Jewish people and God. And this is, one of the dominant ways that the Talmud understands exile. And the 3 oaths were, 1, that Jews would not ascend back to Israel en masse. 2, Jews would not rebel against other nations while in exile. And 3, in return, Gentile nations would not oppress the Jews too excessively. This is what the Talmud says were the, this was the deal between God and the Jews in exile, right? Again, it's part of the Jews attempting to theologically understand their place in exile and whether or not, is God still connected to us? And again, the Talmud was written in a milieu, just to do a little bit of Talmudic history for a second, where they were directly parallel to the Christian world, essentially saying, yes, God has given up on the Jewish people. God has a new covenant. And so the rabbis are very insistent on, of course, the fact that they still have a special relationship with God, and that exile is in some way, right, there is redemption waiting at the end of the exile. And so exile and redemption begin to get, very clear principles within the Talmud. Kim, go for it.
I don't think I understand the Talmudic oaths, because the third one is the Gentile nations will not oppress the Jews too excessively. But I thought I heard you say that this was a quote agreement between Jews and God. So I don't see any indication that any of those Gentile nations were making that promise. So I clearly don't understand.
I think you do understand, and you are predicting the next argument that's a counter to this. In other words, the supposed deal was that God would not let the Gentile nations oppress the Jews too much. Starting in the early 1900s, one of the big turning points in Ashkenazi Zionist history is Kishinev pogrom. Just a brutal pogrom in Eastern Europe. I think it was 1903. It inspired a lot of non-Zionists to become Zionists, right? Especially in Eastern Europe. And as news of the Kishinev pogrom, and we don't have to go too far into it. You can look it up if you've never heard of it. It was just one of these brutal Eastern European pogroms. But for whatever reason, because of the brutality of Kishinev, it began to spread, throughout the Jewish world, as opposed to many other Eastern European pogroms where it happened and, very few people documented it, that some Orthodox Jews' faith in these three oaths began to be a little bit shattered. I don't mean in terms of they stopped believing it, but the argument of what eventually would become the religious Zionist community. Again, I don't want, and then I'll back away from the, theology here, and we can go to a little bit of the sociology. Was that, well, the three oaths are no longer binding because the Gentile nations clearly are oppressing us a lot, so therefore the other two are not binding either. And this is the view that goes into what eventually becomes religious Zionism. Religious Zionism today, in 2025, is one of the, biggest and fastest growing movements in Israel, right? There are many political parties that are under the rubric of religious Zionism. So today it seems like a very mainstream view that one can have. It started off as a very minority view. And the founder was a man named Abraham Isaac Kook. Abraham Isaac Kook was a fascinating man. I was actually just talking about him at Beth El 2 nights ago for a lecture that I was giving. He was a student at the Volozhin Yeshiva, which was, by any account, the top Jewish academy in the at least Ashkenazi world at the time. And so you can imagine you're the Harvard University of the ancient Jewish world, and he was offered a position to be the Rosh Yeshiva, so the head of the Volozhin Yeshiva. So again, he was offered the probably most important position in the Jewish world, right? Jews are people of the book, especially, pre-state. There was no real political positions in the Jewish world. So he was offered to be, the most widely respected intellectual. And instead he turned it down and moved to Jaffa, which, again, this is before Tel Aviv, was even broken ground on. And he said, no, listen, there's this budding movement that's happening, and it seems that there's some value in this movement. He had a famous quote, Hayashan yitchadesh v'achadash yitkadesh, right? The old shall be made new, and the new shall be made holy, right? It's this famous line that he had. In other words, he began to view Zionism, and we'll get into his mindset in a second, because it is a mindset that I think is the fastest growing Zionistic mentality within Israel. So even to understand things like, obviously the debate about settlements, but even more recently, things that we've seen like, what's been happening with the settler community in the last couple of years. It's impossible to understand what's happening, politically and theologically without understanding Rav Kook, right? He begins to write in the early 1900s about how secular politics can be a vehicle for a religious end. What do I mean by that? So let's look in his own words. So he writes a series of essays. This was one of his earlier ones. Then we'll look at one of his later ones, where he says, secular Zionists may think that they do it for political, national, or socialist reasons, but in fact, the actual reason for them coming to resettle in Israel is a religious Jewish spark in their soul, planted by God. Without their knowledge, they're contributing to the divine scheme and actually committing a great mitzvah. So one, he turns what was ostensibly seen by everybody involved in it as a secular project, and he infuses it with religious meaning. He says, they might think that they are building up a state because of political protection or national reasons or social reasons or even, Jewish cultural reasons like Achad Ha'am, but actually they don't realize they're doing this, but they're actually committing a great mitzvah, right? This is, he was Hasidic, just in terms of his background. The Hasidim oftentimes speak about what they, it's called in Yiddish, pinta layid, so the spark that every Jew has. And the idea behind this is no matter how much you stray from the correct path that a Jew should have, every Jew still has that spark in them that only needs to be, lit up, and then they'll return. And so he uses this framework to say, well, the Zionists think that what they're doing is completely secular and a detachment from religion, but they don't realize it, but they are actually acting, on behalf of religion. We'll go into it a little more. Dara, did I see a hand up?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, what year is this? I've lost track of where we are in time.
Yes, this is early 1900s, so
Oh,
pre-state.
early 1900s. Okay.
Yeah, pre-state. We'll go post-state in a few minutes. post-it, it sort of takes a very interesting turn. So he continues and he says, the role of religious Zionists is to help them establish a Jewish state and turn the religious spark in them into a great light. They should show them that the real source of Zionism and the longed for Zion is Judaism, and teach them Torah with love and kindness. In the end, they will understand that the laws of Torah are the key to true harmony and a socialist state that will be a light for the nations and bring salvation to the world. So he goes exactly against the secular Zionistic mentality. And he does this in two ways. One, he says secular Zionists or political Zionists view their political project as a rejection of Messianism, right? This is, the whole thing with Herzl, right? We are done sitting around waiting for the Messiah, right? Herzl's project was, we have lost faith in Jewish tradition to sit around and wait and pray, and we've lost faith in, in his case, French liberal society, right, to keep us safe. Therefore, we need to have a third option, political autonomy in the form of nationalism, right? That's Herzl. Rav Kook is saying, well, Herzl and his ilk, they think that what they're doing is going against Jewish tradition and giving up on the Messiah, but actually what they're doing is the exact path to bring about the Messiah. We just have to show them, right? We have to connect the dots because they don't fully realize what they're doing. He goes on to then have another series of essays. It's called Orot, or Lights. And he says as follows, and then we'll unpack it. He says, if Jewish secular nationalism were really imaginable, then we would indeed be in danger of falling so low as to be beyond redemption. In other words, he's agreeing in some sense with the premise of the ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionists. He's saying, if Jews actually succeeded in forming a secular nationalist state, then you're right. That would be, awful. That would, that would be something that would be so bad the Jews would be beyond redemption. But he says Jewish secular nationalism is a form of self-delusion. The spirit of Israel is so closely linked to the spirit of God that a Jewish nationalist, no matter how secular his intention may be, must, despite himself, affirm the divine. An individual can sever the tie that binds him to life eternal, but the house of Israel as a whole cannot. All its most cherished possessions, its land, language, history, and customs are vessels of the Spirit of the Lord. One more paragraph and then unpack. Despite the grave faults of which we are aware in our life in general, and in Eretz Yisrael in particular, we must feel that we are being reborn, and that we are being created once again as at the beginning of time. Our entire spiritual heritage is presently being absorbed within its source and is reappearing in a new guise, much reduced in material extent, but qualitatively very rich and luxuriant and full of vital force. All of our people believes that we are at the first stage of the final redemption, and this deep faith is the very secret of its existence. It is the divine mystery implicit in its historical experience, and this ancient tradition about the redemption bears witness to the spiritual light by which the Jew understands himself and all events of his history to the last generation, the one that is awaiting the redemption that is near at hand. So Rav Kook comes onto the scene, right? He very quickly becomes the chief rabbi of Jaffa and then becomes unofficially the chief rabbi of the Zionist movement. And then after 1948 becomes the first chief rabbi of Israel. At this time, he doesn't have a very big influence, right? He's writing in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, because the dichotomy between Zionist, secular, Orthodox, anti-Zionist holds pretty widespread. In other words, it's still the case that most of the pioneers, obviously the kibbutz movement, Israel's governments until really the 70s and 80s were made up of just completely secular, right? There were none, it's not today when you look at the Knesset in Israel and, half the men, if not more, are wearing kippot, right? That was not the case in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Rav Kook comes in and starts infusing Zionism with Messianism, right? Or religion, right? Religious Zionism. And his project, and again, we'll kind of go into his project a little bit more, is to suggest that, one, the Zionist movement is not something that Jews should fight against, but actually accept, because Zionism is holy. We just have to understand it as holy. And not just holy, Zionism is the way to actually bring about the Messiah. And he starts writing about this. It gets more influential. We'll talk about what happens once the state is founded in a second. Once the state is founded, he gets more widespread support because, my last fact in the 4 facts that Orthodox Jews kept in mind was clearly this works. And so if he's there saying, at God is behind this movement. Don't listen to the ultra-Orthodox Jews who say that this is, anti-God. And Zionism actually works, right? A state is founded, and in 1948, right, Israel is able to fight back against a series of armies trying to destroy it. And then even more so, after 1967, after the Six-Day War, religious Zionism has a huge boon. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a second, because this is a way to understand the settler movement and everything happening in Israel. But just to take a step back and talk about, once the state is founded. So Rav Kook plants these seeds within the Jewish international consciousness and within the Orthodox Jewish consciousness and within the Zionistic Jewish consciousness. So no longer, after Rav Kook starts writing, is being Orthodox means you are ipso facto not a Zionist, right? A massive organization called Mizrahi is born. It's still around today, which is a international organization, and their entire MO is to, again, talk about how the politics of the state are intrinsically connected to the religious act of Messianism, right? This is going to become important later. So the state is founded, right? I'm fast forwarding through some great history, but I did promise this is more theoretical than historical. Things did happen between 1920 and 1948 that are important for Jewish history. But post-state, the Orthodox Jewish world splinters into three groups. This is a very interesting shift that happens. So one, religious Zionism is still there. More Jews become religious Zionists. So religious Zionism definitely had more of a boom. They started opening up yeshivot, or Jewish academies, across Israel. The second category that grew, where that really was created, was what I'm going to call, I'm coming up with this term, so we can squabble with the exact terminology once I explain what it is, but I'm going to call it de facto non-Zionist acceptance. What do I mean by that? A prime example would be Chabad. So let's talk about the Chabad movement. The sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, so the Rebbe that everybody's heard of was the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe. The sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe spent most of his time in Eastern Europe before eventually coming to America in the 1950s. But most of his writings and work that he did was in Eastern Europe. He set up a series of yeshivot all across the former Soviet Union. He was a vehement anti-Zionist, if you read the writings of what the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe was writing about Zionism, because most of his writings about Zionism were pre-1948, and the Zionism that he's engaging with is one that is, again, trying to quite literally take people out of the Chabad movement and the Chabad schools and make them into, pioneers who are going to join the kibbutzim. 1948 happens. Right now, he's also in the context of America. This is also post-Holocaust, which is a huge shift in ideology within the Orthodox community. And all of a sudden, once Israel is founded, a massive group within the Orthodox world stops being overtly anti-Zionist. They don't accept Zionism, right? So, this is still true today with Chabad, right? If you ask your average Chabad rabbi, are you a Zionist? They will say some mixture of no, or it's complicated, or we don't say the word Zionism, but we like Israel, right? Like there'll be some mixture of confusion with the inability to translate the question into, what we mean when we ask if people are Zionists. And this is what I call de facto non-Zionist acceptance, right? Much of the Litvak world also becomes de facto non-Zionist acceptance. What do I mean by this? After the Holocaust, the majority of the Orthodox community that was still in Europe moved to Israel, right? They moved to Israel and they didn't spend all of their time, trying to tear down the state, right? They de facto became citizens of Israel. They, and we can talk a little bit about, serving in the IDF, because this is an interesting downstream effect of this. They weren't thrilled about the idea of a secular national state, right, for a whole variety of theologic and sociologic reasons, right? And much of the battleground within Israel is actually between this group, between the public and private sphere, because these are people in Israel. This is a mindset where, again, they were not Zionists. Once Israel's founded, they, have understood and accepted the fact that Israel exists. Many of them live there, but they're not willing to lend credence to a lot of secular institutions. So this is one of the reasons why you get a lot of pushback for national service or Israeli army service from a lot of the Orthodox world. And even more so, this is the part of the Jewish world that is, in some sense, pushing the most for religious laws within Israel. And we're going to get back to this at the end when we talk about Supreme Court cases, because I think this is just the most interesting lens to view this through the what is a Jew debate. But the vast majority of the Orthodox world in Israel, this is true right now, are not Zionists, but they are engaging within the state to the extent where it's clear that they're not, trying to tear down the fabric of the state, right? If asked, do you want Israel to be destroyed? They would say no, right? But yet they have a lot of problems with Israel, and they're not willing to sign on to Zionism because Israel is a secular state. And so they're working, from within the bounds. I'm sure there's some fancy political science theory for this, but they're working within the norms of a democratic state to push their policies through normative politics, right? Canvassing, trying to win elections, trying to have ads, trying to, peacefully protest and everything, right? This is the second part of the Orthodox world. The third, and this is a group in the Orthodox world that became much more vehement after the state, because it's one thing to say pre-1948 you're against Zionism, right? This was a mainstream opinion in the Orthodox world, right? If we go pre-1920s, this was a mainstream opinion in the entire Jewish world, right? We talked about this 2 classes ago, right? So the anti-Zionism of the Jewish world of 1910, right? It was there. It was pretty harsh, right? We read Lucian Wolf's essay, I think, maybe 2 weeks ago, right? So definitely a lot of people did not love Zionism, right? The way in which rabbis were talking about Zionism in the year 1910 also wasn't great. But once Israel was founded, some subset of the ultra-Orthodox world, most famous is Satmar. Satmar, interestingly enough, is the largest Hasidic community, right? It's bigger than Chabad. It's just a lot more insular. Almost all Satmar Jews either live in New York or Israel, who came out with, they refused to kind of go the way of Chabad, which they, de facto non-Zionist acceptance, and they made it at the core of their religious mission to actually disband Zionism. Huge shift that happened in the Orthodox community, right? There's some even more extreme versions of this view, like Neturei Karta, right? These are the people that I'm sure everybody's seen, the very religious Jews who have been, pretty ubiquitous at anti-Israel rallies. Again, it mostly happens in New York because there are not a lot of Satmar Jews hanging out in Orange County. But these people, right, Satmar explicitly, and we'll read a excerpt from Yoel Teitelbaum, who was the Rebbe of Satmar. Not only was Zionism seen as something secular that they didn't want, they began to see Zionism as, and Shaul Magid, who's a fascinating scholar of Hasidism, he calls it the Jewish equivalent to an antichrist. In other words, the Satmar movement began to view Zionism as actually the reason for the brokenness of the world, and actually the reason why redemption hasn't come yet is because of Zionism, right? And then you get one of the harshest essays probably ever written against Zionism, so brace yourself for a second. Let me actually fast forward one slide, where Yoel Teitelbaum, writing this in the either the 1950s or 60s, it's certainly post-Holocaust, as you'll see in a second, where he explicitly links the Holocaust with Zionism. And again, this, Satmar still today is the largest Hasidic community. So this is not, 15 people hanging out, in some room in New York. This is, at least 100, maybe 200,000, depending on how you count Jews, right? So he writes, everyone ignores the fact that it had been these Zionist groups that have attracted the Jewish people and have violated the oath against establishing a Jewish entity before the arrival of the Messiah, right? So he couches this in purely theologic terms. He goes on to say, there's no doubt that the death of the 6 million Jews was due to the concept of having a state. The Zionists are always in trouble in placing the Jews in danger. The Torah says that we must not ignore the blood of our brothers, and yet these people are silent. Even in the United States, the Zionists struggle to bring about anti-Semitism, just as they did in Europe. We need tremendous mercy from God to prevent them from succeeding, because with their slander and arrogance, they can bring it about. Right? This is as explicit as it gets in terms of Jewish theology against Zionism. And, what, many scholars of this, right? There's some, very interesting theories of, say the classic, Leon Festinger theories of cognitive dissonance, where, the problem for the anti-Zionist religious world, I'm not talking about the anti-Zionist not religious world, is that Zionism worked, right? Which, if your whole premise is that this is not what God wants, and then if your worldview is interpreting everything through miraculous lenses, and Zionism actually works, and the 1948 war, even though Israel seemingly was outnumbered, Israel survived, and in 1967, right, again, Israel not only survived, but actually was now in control of much of the more holy sites. It's very hard to rectify that with, but this is not what God wants. And so this is where you get, again, the doubling down and harshness from the ultra-Orthodox, from some subset, again, of the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community against Zionism. So this becomes, the three mainstream opinions, right? You can almost fit any Orthodox group into one of these three categories. One more thing to say about this middle ground, and then we will move on to the Supreme Court rulings, because I think that'll be very interesting, and I think that will touch on all the tensions we've talked about in the last 4 weeks, is this middle group and much of the ultra-Orthodox community that kind of came to begrudgingly accept the reality of Israel. There's a famous story between what at that time was the head of the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, a man named the Chazon Ish, and Ben Gurion. And this is sort of one of the famous, everybody knows, or not everybody, I'll say it, but most people sort of have heard this apocryphal story of, the ultra-Orthodox Jews in the days leading up to the UN vote, right? The Zionists were on sort of a, political campaigning tour to try to get as many states as they can to vote yes on UN partition plan, and it was unclear at the last moment if they were going to get enough votes or not. And so Ben Gurion and the Zionist movement, right, wanted a united front of all Jews in the world want this to happen, right? Especially this is now 3 or 4 years after the Holocaust. You still have Holocaust survivors in, displaced persons camp and places. And so the ultra-Orthodox community was on the fence, right? They were saying, well, we don't know if we want to present ourselves as a part of this united front, that we are obviously in favor of Zionism. So there's then a series of meetings between Ben Gurion and the head of the ultra-Orthodox world. And this is an excerpt from one of their conversations that was later published into a short pamphlet by somebody who was in the room. So this is a quote from their conversation. I believe this is 1952. So this is the year. There's the question of existence, of preserving human life. Ben Gurion recounted saying to the Chazon Ish, shouldn't love of the Jewish people, Israel, take precedence over everything? In other words, the argument that the secular, again, Ben Gurion was, a political or labor Zionist, right? He was attached to Jewish tradition, but not through a religious lens, right? He was, atheist till his last days, even though he did love the Tanakh and stuff. And so he says, what about, love of people of Israel? So the Chazon Ish responded that although love of Israel and love of Torah may seem like separate things, they're not, because there's no Torah without Israel and no Israel without Torah. In other words, right, sort of this uncompromising perspective of, you're only bringing half, right? It doesn't make sense if you say that you're going to cut yourself in half, right, and cut your head off, and you say, do you want to try to save the body or the head, right? The Chazon Ish is saying this is sort of a ridiculous question. You need both together, right? So he was unwilling to sort of accept the political Zionist argument that you have to do it to protect Jews, even if Israel is not going to be a religious state. So Navon, who was, I think he ended up being either in the Knesset or he had some big position in Israeli politics later, but he was in the meeting. So writing sometime later about the meeting, responded about how Rabbi Karlitz, right, that was his actual name, not the Chazon Ish, is just his pen name, responding to Ben Gurion's query regarding how can we live together. So he describes a scene in the Talmud, and this is, for anybody who likes good Talmudic cases, right, this is a simple one where two camels meet on a path and they both get there first. So no one has the right of way. The modern equivalent is, you pull up to a 4-way stop sign and there's somebody else that's right there at the same time, right? How do you know who goes first? And the Talmud gives a number of ways of trying to figure out, what you do at a 4-way stop sign. So one of the things the Talmud suggests is that, well, if one of the camels is carrying a heavy load and the other camel is not, then clearly the camel that's carrying a lot of material should be given right of way, right? This, sort of makes sense in terms of, stop sign ethics. So the Chazon Ish says the moral of the parable was that we, the religious Jews, are analogous to the camel with the load. We carry a burden of hundreds of commandments. You, secular Israel, have to give way. In other words, this is still the approach of the Orthodox community to the secular state of Israel. In other words, there's no, right, this is not, two people coming with sort of equal epistemologies. From the Orthodox perspective, secular Zionism and all of the stuff we've talked about the last couple of weeks is sort of an empty load, quote unquote. So Ben Gurion attempts to mount a counter argument, and he says, is the second camel also weighed down? The commandment to settle the land isn't a burden. The commandment to defending life aren't mitzvot. And what's with those boys who are so opposed to sitting on the borders and protecting you? Is that not a mitzvah? In other words, right, the classic retort, right, that probably everybody here is thinking right now, but like, it's not true that the other half is doing nothing. They're protecting the country. They're doing all these things. Karlitz was not able to agree, according to Navon, that the learners' lives were protected by those serving in the army. Rather, he insisted that it is only thanks to the fact that we learn Torah that they, the soldiers, are able to exist. In other words, the idea that we think, well, the ultra-Orthodox are sitting in yeshivot, don't they realize that the apparatus of the state, including the military and, other things, are actually allowing them to stay in the yeshivot? And according to this conversation, no, right? It's vice versa. It's only because of the merit of the people learning Torah that the secular state is able to exist, right? It's the, the Chazon Ish was saying, well, your cause and effect are mixed up. This is still, this is now, a 65-year-old or 70-year-old dated conversation. This is still the exact conversation going on right now in the Orthodox community, right? This is still the mainstream ultra-Orthodox in Israel, the Haredi approach towards the state. This is now true both of ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi community and ultra-Orthodox Sephardi community. If you think of, the political party shop, this is why, just to unpack why many ultra-Orthodox Jews refuse to serve in the army. This is why, the engagement with the state is only insofar as the state has to become more and more religious, with also the sort of uncompromising nature of, we are the only ones who kind of even have a valid approach here. And so there's very little compromise to happen. I want to propose, and I'll sort of summarize this part, and then we'll get into some questions about Supreme Court cases and who is a Jew and how it connects. But this debate between the religious Zionists and the ultra-Orthodox, which now within the Orthodox community of Israel, these are the two biggest growing communities of Jews in Israel, the Haredim and religious Zionists, right? They both have many more kids than, secular Israeli political Zionists. So people like Ben Gurion and Golda Meir, right, they are becoming, an ever-increasing minority, right? This also explains much of Israel's, political shift in the last, 30, 40 years, right? There's other factors, Mizrahi Jews, and also, the fall of the Soviet Union, right? So I don't want to oversimplify this too much, but these groups are both growing. And in some way, again, there's becoming less of a clear dividing line. So now they are starting to bleed into each other. People have started talking about a Chardal community that's a Haredi Dati Leumi, so an ultra-Orthodox religious Zionist. But this conversation about whether or not Israel and the secular state is something that is not ideal, we don't like, maybe should even be fought against, but even if it exists, to kind of have as little to do with as possible, right? That's one view. That's the view that Israel and Zionism is a rejection of Jewish tradition, right? This falls into our exact neat categories. The religious Zionist view that this is a vehicle for redemption, and that this is actually the culmination of Jewish history. And in the religious Zionist parlance, it is Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu, which means the first stage of the redemption, literally the beginning of the flowering of the redemption, right? Where everything is infused with Messianism. This is the view that Zionism is a direct continuation of Jewish tradition. So Zionists, original Zionist thinkers couldn't decide on this topic of whether or not Zionism is a movement of continuity and rupture, and the Orthodox Jewish community is still having this debate about whether or not Zionism is a continuity or rupture. So I want to pause just to see if anybody has any questions on this, and then we'll look at some Supreme Court cases that I think will highlight this tension, because this is not a tension that ended in, the 1900s. This is still, as I opened class with, the reason why I think people are so confused about Zionism is because of this tension that's at the core of everything. And my essential argument is, anytime somebody attempts to argue only one thing, they're missing the other half of the story. And so anybody who says, well, it's clear that Zionism has nothing to do with Judaism and it's a new trend and it's just, European, politics and nationalism, they've missed half the story. And everyone who says Zionism has nothing to do with, what was happening in Europe. This is clearly just, Jews returning to their ancient homeland and, the exact thing that, all of our ancestors were waiting for, right? They're also sort of missing half the equation. Rhea, did you have a hand? Go for it.
Yeah, so I have, there's two questions, and one of them is the Gush movement and how it fits in there. And the other one is the born-again Christian community have the same story about Armageddon and all the Jews will return to the land of Israel, and then the Messiah will that it's also it has almost the same story, and I just wanted to know if they link at all in conversation, or do they exist in separate spheres?
It's an interesting question. Let's start with Gush Emunim. So Gush Emunim was sort of the original settler movement. So after the 6-Day War, and this also explains the huge divide in Israeli society. There's sort of three views in Israeli society after the 6-Day War. I'm going to be overly reductionary, but you'll all forgive me. One view was the peace camp, which, oh great, we have all this new land. How can we leverage this into land for peace, right? That became the mentality, right? That continued until Yitzhak Rabin, it kind of died out during the Second Intifada, right? There's very few land for peace people anymore. The secular right wing, right? This is people like Menachem Begin and, the modern party of Bibi Netanyahu and, even before that, people like Zev Jabotinsky. They were always, peace through strength. So their perspective was, we're not going to start with land for peace. We're going to start with strength. We're not philosophically opposed to a two-state solution, but we're not going to start with that, right? We can only, as Jabotinsky wrote, the only way that Zionists are going to be successful is if we show that we are just so strong that nothing can permeate us, right? His most famous essay was called The Iron Wall, because he essentially said Israel needs to turn into an iron wall that nothing can get to it. And after that, you'll have peace, because the enemies will realize, well, it doesn't seem reasonable to attack, this iron wall. You're not going to keep punching an iron wall. So you live with it, right? That was the right-wing secular perspective, but the right wing was not philosophically necessarily opposed to land for peace, right? We saw this with Menachem Begin, right? Menachem Begin actually was willing to give up land for peace, right? He was willing to negotiate with Egypt, and he gave up the Sinai. He was also willing to give up Gaza, by the way. Egypt didn't want it, right? That's another story. And so the religious Zionists, and this is where you get with Gush Emunim, started saying, well, redemption, is not supposed to, have backtracks, right? In other words, redemption is, should be a linear graph, not a, it shouldn't look like an EKG, right? In other words, once Israel/Jews are in control of land, to give that up is to actually reverse the Messianic process and something that is completely antithetical to Judaism. So the settler movement essentially was built around the premise of, one, obviously settling parts of the land of Israel, right? But two, the sort of political goal of the settler movement, again, I'm going to be descriptive, not normative here, is to say, how can we make sure that it will be really difficult to ever have a two-state solution, right? We just need to set up as many Jewish neighborhoods as possible all around Judea and Samaria / the West Bank / whatever we want to call it. And we just need to make sure that a two-state solution is going to be untenable. Now, the interesting thing, right, the other major breaking point in settler movement was after 2005, Israel's disengagement from Gaza. There were also Jews living in Gaza. There was, tens of thousands of Jews that were living in settlements across the Gaza Strip. And Israeli government, actually a right-wing government, right, a Likud government, Ariel Sharon, right, again, right-wing but not religious Zionist, essentially, right, forced the settlers out, right? There's some harrowing videos you can still watch about the disengagement from Gaza. And according to a lot of sociologists of the religious Zionist movement, breaks were already happening from the 90s. But this kind of split the religious Zionist movement into half between a moderate group and an extremist group, right? The extremist group we sort of, sadly see whenever we look at the news about, settler violence. Even before that, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin was obviously by somebody from the religious Zionist community. The other half, which is actually the majority of the religious Zionist community, was, appalled at that and essentially began to have a much more nuanced view of what Messianism meant. And, they stopped being so, right. This is people like Aaron Lichtenstein, just to give a name, right. He was the Rosh Yeshiva of the major yeshiva actually in Gush Etzion called Gush. And so this was a fight that's actually still being had right now in the religious Zionist community between, how extreme do you need to live out your politics versus, how much not. Dara, I think I saw your hand as well.
Well, I think you started to answer because I was trying to understand, like in present day, there seems to me to be even some loosening among the people that you call I don't have the right term, the anti-Zionists, but accepting the state of Israel. There seems to be a loosening in there with some consideration of some of their kids serving in the military, but I didn't know if you had that. That was my impression. Do you feel that way or no? Things are just still as defined as you presented.
Maybe a little, maybe there are a couple cracks. But I mean, we saw it with the protest against being drafted to the IDF. I think the interesting shift, Satmar is starting to go, some people in Satmar are starting to go more towards the second category. So, this wasn't, I forgot who I was talking to about this, but they said that they visited the Satmar community in New York, and it's like a rebellious thing, where a lot of the young people were starting to read, Zionist literature, right? That's the way to rebel if you're in the Satmar community. So there, I think especially because of, the last 2 years and October 7th and everything, there isn't as much in the Satmar community extreme anti-Zionism, right? All of the on the streets, ultra-Orthodox Jews joining the protest movement, that's Neturei Karta. Neturei Karta is not Satmar. A lot of Satmar Jews have said, they've gone on the record and said that they are ashamed about what Neturei Karta is doing because it's giving them a bad name, because no one can tell the difference between them, right? They're both ultra-Orthodox Jews that are anti-Zionist. So that's a trend that's happening. And you're right. I mean, Chabad is another interesting example. Many Chabad youth are starting to go to the army in Israel. But Chabad's always been the most socially progressive of any ultra-Orthodox group, right? By dint of, there's Chabads everywhere. Chabad has the philosophy of specifically spreading out to not becoming more insular, which is unique. And so in that sense, yes, but still in the mainstream ultra-Orthodox world, Chabad's, not nearly as widespread in Israel as we think of it as in Orange County. It's still, there's a lot of tension. Rhea, you had a second question, and I totally forgot what it was. And then I'll answer the questions in the chat, and then I want to go on to the Supreme Court cases.
Oh, okay. So it's about the sense of Armageddon, the Christian community, the born again, that their view of Israel, they want to promote it because all the ingathering of the Jews into the land, and then becomes the Armageddon, and they'll rise up to Jesus. And then we have the ultra Orthodox of, you had mentioned about the ingathering of the Jews on the land. These are two movements that exist, or one movement that exists in totally opposite communities. So do you have anything to clear this up?
Yeah, I mean, there are sort of different theologies. So, I mean, this is true for any, secular Zionist, religious Zionist. People in Israel have been happy to take, funding and defense and PR from, more, fundamentalist Christian community. It hasn't studied the Orthodox theology at all. In other words, right? I don't, and actually there's been an interesting, this is, again, I go down too many rabbit holes, but, right now on the American right, it's sort of obvious that there's, a split happening between, say, Nick Fuentes types, right? The Grapers, or, generally a lot of, young Christian men, right? That tends to be who makes up a lot of these groups. And, what you might call, I guess a couple years ago, we would have called them classic conservatives, but, that whole category has been a little bit muddied, but, non-Gripers, let's say, right? This is, again, a little bit overly reductionary, but some of the anti-Semites that are now growing on the right are starting to, challenge this whole idea of, why should we be supporting Israel? Israel's not supportive of our theologic message. And what they're pointing to is Israel has understandably, cracked down on a lot of, public proselytation efforts that were happening. There were a lot of stories of a lot of Christian money pouring into Israel with the explicit goal of trying to proselytize Israeli Jews to convert to Christianity. Israel has cracked down on that, right? Spearheaded by a lot of ultra-Orthodox Jews, right? The secular Jews in Tel Aviv don't really care if there's a preacher on their corner because, it's, whatever, right? But it's the Orthodox Jews that are, the most upset by this. So there are some interesting cracks forming there also. I will throw an article into the chat where this is Shaul Magid's article about, Satmar and everything. It's a fascinating article. I do want to, respond to Hunter's comment, and then I want to save at least 15 minutes for the Supreme Court cases. Hunter asked if Menachem Begin ever wavered on the charter of Likud, which was river to sea. So Menachem Begin, the original revisionist movement, it was even bigger than, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. They wanted the whole thing, meaning they wanted Jordan, they wanted some of Iraq, right? If you look at the map of, what Jabotinsky wanted, and this is, the reason why Jabotinsky wanted this, just to unpack it before answering the question, is because this was, if you look in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh, and, right, the Tanakh is interesting because there are many different times where the borders of Israel are laid out throughout the Tanakh. It happens in Devarim / Deuteronomy, happens again in Joshua, happens again in the Book of Kings, right? And every time it's a little bit different of exactly what the borders are, which leads to a lot of very interesting questions. There's still an open question, by the way, in the Orthodox Jewish community of whether or not Eilat is considered part of Israel, right? And this actually has repercussions for, I'll give you a very concrete example. In Jewish tradition, if you're in the diaspora, you keep 2 days of a Jewish holiday. If you're in Israel, you keep 1 day of a Jewish holiday. What do you do if you go to Eilat? So a lot of Orthodox rabbis have actually said it's better not to go to Eilat for Jewish holidays because you don't want to be subjected to this controversy. So Jabotinsky took the maximum amount of borders, right, if you combined all the different accounts, and that's what you would get, Greater Israel. I can pull up a map in a second. But essentially, that was given up, right? The entirety of the revisionist Zionist community did accept, right? This is a map of Greater Israel here. So quite a lot bigger than Israel today. But yeah, I would argue there was sort of a de facto acceptance that this was not going to happen after 1948. And now nobody talks about this. Now, when people say Greater Israel, they mean, again, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. No one's talking about this. But this was, for a long time, the revisionist Zionists, if you were a revisionist Zionist in the 1920s and you were wearing a necklace of what you wanted Israel to look like, this is what it would have looked like, not, the Israel that we think of today. Okay. Supreme Court cases. Let me figure out which slide this was on because I have too many slides up. I'll just pull it up again. So I want to go through what I think is a very interesting question. It's often an interesting question for American Jews who are always sort of obsessed with this question of Jewish identity and who is Jewish. It's obviously been a big debate in the Jewish community, but as pertaining to Israel, right? So the four questions, right? You can kind of summarize our four classes with these questions, right? Is Zionism a continuity or rupture? We talked about with Herzl, is anti-Semitism an inherent or essentialized feature, or can it be defeated? Another way of saying this is, should anti-Semitism play any role in our self-definition as Jews? In other words, should we define what it means to be Jewish, or should we allow anti-Semites such as, say, to play a role in how we conceive of Jewish identity? 3, is the Zionistic ideal of the new Jew a rejection of the diaspora? We talked about that last time. And 4, is Zionism religious or anti-religious, right? These are all unanswered questions that there are strong voices on both sides. So this has, comes to the forefront in many places, right? We can talk about buses running on Shabbat, or whether or not, Israel's had a very interesting debate about pork laws, right? Is it legal under Israeli law to raise pigs, right? This has been a big debate in Israeli history and everything, but probably the most interesting ramification corresponds to the right of return. So in 1950, right, one of the first major laws that Israel passes is that any Jew can return to Israel, right? Any Jew can obtain citizenship in Israel. This obviously begs the question of, who is a Jew, right? Who defines this? And by what metric? Is this a religious definition? Is this a new nationalistic secular definition? Is there something that it's like to be a cultural Jew? And so, right, just David Ben-Gurion, right, when he was, introducing this law in the Knesset, right, he says, the law does not provide for the state to bestow the right to settle upon the Jew living abroad. It affirms that this right is inherent in him from the very fact of being a Jew. The state does not grant the right of return to the Jews of the diaspora. This right preceded the state. This right built the state. Its source is to be found in the historic and never broken connection between the Jewish people and homeland. So the way in which the right of return is conceived is that this isn't even, the right of a nation that's bestowing on people, that Jews, right, in the words of David Ben-Gurion, that Jews worldwide, anybody who is Jewish, has a right to go to Israel. It's not that Israel has allowed that right? By very dint of being Jewish, you have a right, which again just doubles down on this question. Okay, well, who is Jewish? So 3 fascinating Supreme Court cases. And so I'll present these cases, and then I'm sure we're going to have a difference of opinion here about what should have been done in all these cases. So I'm excited for that. 1962, brother Daniel, a Polish Jewish Holocaust survivor, hid in a Catholic convent, converted to Catholicism, and became a monk. He then applies to citizenship in the 1960s into Israel under the right of return. So just taking a step back, thinking about this from, all the different perspectives. According to Orthodox Jewish law or Jewish tradition, going back to the medieval period, once a Jew, always a Jew, right? This was affirmed by the Talmud. This is affirmed by medieval Jewish legal scholars, right? All throughout history, you had times where Jews often converted to different religions to escape persecution, and they were welcome back in the Jewish community. There was no need to reconvert into Judaism right? Judaism has the strong ethnic component, and so they were considered, sinful Jews. It's not to say that Judaism said, well, yeah, sure, be a Christian or be a Jew, right? So there's such a thing in classical Jewish tradition as doing Jewish the right way or the wrong way, but as Rashi, right, the medieval French sage, says, a Jew, even who sins, is still a Jew. So that would have been the traditional Jewish response. Again, the national, at this time in Israel, it's still mostly a secular government. So the Israeli Supreme Court rules against him. Why? A Jew who voluntarily adopts another religion is no longer considered Jewish under the right of return. In the majority opinion, there was a minority opinion, he didn't meet popular definition of Jewishness, right? Very vague, right? This is this is not the sharp legal writing you would hope for a such a touchy Supreme Court. But it kind of goes with the jibe that I imagine most people here are saying, where if a Catholic monk popped into the Zoom call, we would all immediately label that person as not Jewish, right? And if that person revealed that his mother was Jewish and he converted 30 years ago, that would probably do little to move us, right, on whether or not we see him as Jewish. So one, just to keep in mind, this is an anti-halachic ruling. In other words, from the outset of the Supreme Court, they were arguing that the definition of Jewishness of the state of Israel is a new definition. It's a rupture from Jewish tradition. This is not the Jewishness that we find in classic Jewish sources, right? So Israel is already starting off, right, as the right of return was codified starting in the 60s, as creating this differentiation, right? This is the first time, the sort of a famous story behind this. This is actually a true story. You can read about this. David Ben-Gurion didn't know what to do. He actually wrote letters to Jewish scholars and rabbis all across the Jewish world. I think some of those letters are still there, and he sort of compiled all the opinions, and this is what the government he did this in the 50s, not in the 60s, but this is what the government, finally decides when they have to rule on it. Okay, case number 1, and then we'll unpack all of them. Case number 2 is a Israeli man named Benjamin Shalit, right? This happens in the 1960s. This is also a very interesting case. So he was an Israeli naval officer, right? So very embedded within Israeli society. He was born in Israel, but he married a non-Jewish woman. And, right, according to Jewish law, right, Orthodox Jewish law, Jewish identity, unless you convert, it is necessary and sufficient to have a Jewish mother, right? Patrilineal descent in Orthodoxy is not a thing. And so Israeli guy, right, again, fully Jewish, obviously, fully Israeli, he has children. from a non-Jewish woman, right? So these children are not halachically Jewish, but he goes to the interior minister and asks to register, right? Israel keeps track of people's religious background, right? For purposes of one, census, but two, Israel doesn't have, things like secular marriage. So if you want to get married in Israel as a Jew, you have to go through the rabbis. If you're a Christian, you have to go through, religious clergy. So it's very important, what you are, right? In terms of the eyes of a state. So he goes, he tries to get his children registered as Jews, and the interior minister, which at this point already had some ultra-Orthodox influence, they turn this down, right? They say, sorry, your kids are not halachically Jewish, right? It butts against, the Jewish tradition. He then I don't know about sue if the right word, but he brings it to the courts. It eventually makes its way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules in his favor, right? So the Supreme Court reverses the ruling of the interior minister and instructs the state to register the children as Jews. And then they add to their amendment of the right of return, and they say a person born of a Jewish mother or who has converted to Judaism and is not a member of another religion. So the interior minister says no. The Supreme Court says yes. Then there's backlash in Israeli society because they say, well, wait a minute. You're operationalizing a definition of Judaism that's not found in tradition. So then after all the backlash, this amendment is then added to the right of return. So far, we still have total confusion about the right of return. It seems like sometimes it is a halachic category. Sometimes it's not halachic. Sometimes it's national. Sometimes it's not national, right? Essentially, and we'll see one more case, but what I want to argue, and not me, right? There's been a lot of scholarship on this, is that the definition of Judaism within Israel is something completely new, right? It's not a national definition or ethnic definition or religious definition. Israel has just created a new definition through all these Supreme Court's cases of who is a Jew. It's very interesting. Kim asked how much is driven by the need of the state at this time. So it's a good question. I'm not sure. That's the honest answer. I was like trying to think but it is a good question of how much of this is, top down or bottom up. In other words, actual ideology driving this, or just, well, we can't have 5 million new people coming in that, don't really have a strong, connection to Judaism. Interestingly enough, this does, right? There were two cases of Jewish migrations to Israel where this did become a big deal. One is with Ethiopian Jews. This happened earlier on, where you had tens of thousands of Jews come to Israel from Ethiopia. Israel actually helped airlift them out of Ethiopia. But the problem was this Ethiopian Jewish community had essentially been severed from the rest of the Jewish world for a couple of generations, to the extent where most Orthodox Jews looked at them and said, we don't actually trust, what's called your yichus, right? We don't trust your lineage that you're actually Jewish. So you're actually all going to have to, right? You're welcome in the country, but none of you are Jewish, right? You're all going to have to convert, right? This was seen as very offensive. And the chief Sephardic rabbi of the 20th century, a man named Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, right? Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, just to go on a little bit of a tangent, I always ask this question to undergrads, and this always highlights the disparity between American Jewish and Israeli Jewish society. I ask them, and I kind of gave you the answer already, but I say, what was the most attended funeral in the last 100 years in the Jewish world? And, people guess, I don't know, Louis Brandeis or Albert Einstein or maybe David Ben-Gurion, right? There's lots of answers that you might want to levy. It was Ovadia Yosef. He had almost 1 million people show up to his funeral. And he, again, literally 15% of the Jews in Israel showed up to his funeral. One of the reasons why Ovadia Yosef, again, the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, was so loved was because he was a stalwart defender of Mizrahi rights against the Ashkenazi, hegemony that existed both in the secular community and in the religious community. And he actually stood up for the Ethiopian Jews and said, no, they're Jewish, they don't need to convert. But again, this question was still touchy. The second time it was touchy was in the fall of the Soviet Union. You had 900,000 or 1 million Jews go to Israel with also, right, the Soviet Union obviously banned religion for multiple generations. You had a lot of people who were intermarried, or a lot of people that had been not really practicing Judaism for a couple of generations. People didn't exactly know, was your maternal grandmother Jewish? Nobody had been practicing anything, right? And so a lot of former Soviet Jews, when they went to Israel, there were also all these questions about, well, do we accept them as Jewish or not? this is actually still an issue in the Israeli public sphere between the Jewishness of former Soviet Jews and who sees them as Jewish. Do the ultra-Orthodox see them as Jewish? Does the interior minister, right? Exact definition. So, but the last case, and then we can unpack all this, because if you're looking for easy answers, this was not the class series to come to, was a woman named Shoshana Beresford. And she was a American woman who converted to Judaism through a Reform synagogue, right? She then immigrates to Israel, right? She's eligible for right of return, right? Because if you remember, right, Supreme Court, right, says if you convert to Judaism, right, that means they're converting through any denomination, right? They don't stipulate a house. But she, after being eligible for right of return, went to the interior minister and said, I want to be registered as Jewish, right? Maybe I want to get married or, be buried in a Jewish cemetery, right? Like, I want people to know that I'm Jewish, right? This is a problem because the interior minister by the 80s was very heavily influenced by ultra-Orthodoxy and said, well, sorry, you're not Jewish, right? Halachic definition of Judaism does not fit a non-Orthodox conversion. She then takes them to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules in favor of her and says that actually a non-Orthodox conversion, and again, you can almost imagine the Talmudic thumb waving here, performed outside of Israel has to be recognized for civil purposes. So in other words, they say, well, if you were converted through reform in Israel, we wouldn't accept it. But if you come into Israel already being Jewish, we accept that, right? By the way, this is the exact same thing with marriage, right? Everyone's probably heard the story, but Israel has no gay marriage. So what do Israelis do? They go to Cyprus or Greece for the weekend. They get married, and then Israel accepts, well, you were already married when you came in, so who are we to say you're not married? So they essentially say the same thing with her. Well, you converted, you're Jewish, we're going to register you as Jewish. The Supreme Court then in 2021, again, this is under a lot more pressure from a lot of liberal Jewish groups of pressuring the Israeli government, then said even non-Orthodox converts in Israel have to be considered Jewish from the interior minister's perspective. But I will add, there's still a difference between right of return, interior definition, and who ultra-Orthodox Jews will officiate a marriage for, right? So just because someone's eligible for right of return and censuses they're considered Jewish does not mean if they then go to get married, and the ultra-Orthodox Jews control marriage in Israel, if they then try to get married, an ultra-Orthodox Jew will say, well, sorry, you're not really Jewish. So a lot of people are still in limbo, right? This isn't the time to, debate all the ins and outs and who's right or wrong about this. But these questions are all coming from the same tension of, what Israel is doing within, Jewish tradition or lack thereof, right, is the goal of Israel and Zionism, right? One definition of the right of return, which is the most political Zionisty definition, is to say, well, essentially, it's just an Israeli version of the opposite of Nuremberg, right? Whoever anti-Semitism affects negatively, Israel is the home for them, right? And that is a perfectly fine definition of Jewishness and who needs protection against anti-Semitism, right? Another definition of, well, if the point of Israel is to be a Jewish religious state that operates according to the confines of Jewish law, then of course those people should not be considered Jewish, right? Maybe Israel should, help them in some other way, or maybe, obviously the global community should help them, but Israel is for Jews and those people are not Jewish. And so you can almost, see the debate on both sides about this of, who is a Jew, but more fundamentally, it gets to the question of what does it actually mean that Israel is a Jewish state, which again, gets back to Zionism. What does it actually mean that Zionism is a Jewish movement? Is it a new Jewish movement, an old Jewish movement, a secular Jewish movement, a religious Jewish movement, right? You can kind of see all the questions floating here. This is obviously an unanswered question at the moment. So there's no final slide with me saying that I've solved it. But I think most of the arguments, both within Israeli, society and public, and also in terms of international confusion about what Zionism is and what it isn't, is because fundamentally Zionism, I think in an email I got from Kim, I'll out you, right? The sort of wave and particle duality of physics, right? So it kind of just depends on what angle you're looking at Zionism, of whether or not you can draw a straight line through Jewish tradition and continuity and longing for Israel, or whether or not Zionism is sort of a explicit right turn away from, the natural ordering of Jewish tradition. And they're both essentially right. The reason why I wanted to present both arguments every class is it's very easy to come up with just an argument for one side. I mean, I easily could have done it if my goal was to say just that Zionism is a continuity of Jewish tradition. I can be talking until next Wednesday, and also vice versa. So happy to stay for any questions, but thank you all. I wanted to just thank everyone one more time. This was both a lot of fun, so I think we're going to do this again. I've been talking to both Dara and Tammy, and think we want to do this, at least twice a year, in terms of just a short online class for people in the community. We'll pick another topic next time, so I'll do some crowdsourcing to what people want. But again, I am here. I'm happy to hang out. If anybody has any and all questions, I obviously can talk about this till very late at night.
I want to
I
thank
just have a.
you. Oh,
Oh, sorry.
no, I
Go
just
ahead.
want to
Go
say
ahead.
thank you for doing this.
Yes.
And I hope that maybe in the near future that you think about another series that is really relevant in what's going on. So thank you.
Yes, well, thank you, Rhea. Was that Hunter? I don't know whose voice that was
Oh,
before.
yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to ask like a clarification because you mentioned, I don't know if I missed this part. You mentioned like the Satmar movement and how they like differentiate themselves from Nidorai Karta, but they're both anti-Zionist. What was that distinction about?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one, Satmar is Hasidic and Neturei Karta is Litvak. So just in terms of like the different types of Orthodox, they are just coming from different, branches off the Orthodox tree. Neturei Karta is a much smaller, more fringe group that they're, let's say one big thing that differentiated Neturei Karta from Satmar is somebody can look up the year, but the heads of Neturei Karta met with Khomeini, the head of Iran. Let me just look up when that was so I don't give you a faulty. This is sometime in right after the Iranian Revolution, right? So at least if we trust the first Google search, it's 1979. I'm sure there's probably more information, but Neturei Karta explicitly met with, the head of Iran, who was saying that his goal was the genocidal intent against Israel, right? Same with Hezbollah historically. So they are, again, much more extreme, if you will, with, who they're willing to meet. And, their goal is essentially, Israel needs to be taken down at all costs. Satmar openly condemned Neturei Karta's meeting with people like that. They're not happy about Israel, right? They also want to see Israel go, but not through, Iran violence against that. So it's just, they have the same ideology, but the tactics that they're willing to use to pursue that's a huge differentiation. I'll throw a video because I keep mentioning Shaul Magid, but he's a Jewish studies professor at Harvard, and he's one of the foremost scholars of Satmar and also Zionism and all this. And so he has a lot of interesting differentiations also. So I'll throw I had a conversation with him about explicitly Orthodox anti-Zionism probably half a year ago. So I'll throw that in the chat if anybody's curious. So yeah, good question.
I have
Thank you.
a question from last week from the War of Languages.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you mentioned that pro-Hebrew language speakers bombed a newspaper office of pro-German language users. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. So starting from right before World War I, so I think 1912, 1913, there was a huge debate in the Zionist movement as to what language should be the national language of the Zionist movement and what, language would schools have and everything. And so you had, different activists on both sides. One was German, one was, to try to, do this new weird language, Hebrew. And so again, mostly it was, strongly worded periodicals and, right. So this wasn't like fist fights breaking out between the Hebraicists and Germans. But in sort of the most infamous act, there was a German Zionist newspaper in Vienna in 1913 or 1914 that essentially like some Zionist youth snuck in overnight and, put a couple cherry bombs and blew up the printing machine and everything. So it was just sort of like the final culmination just to show that this was a very intense debate. It never turned really violent or anything like that between these two sides. There were other violent, inter-Zionist feuds, or almost violent. The most famous and most interesting was between the revisionists and political Zionists. In the 30s and 40s, you had one group, what was the Haganah, which turned into the IDF, which was the paramilitary of the liberal or the political Zionists. Sorry, better than a liberal. Liberal only happens after. So the political Zionist paramilitary was the Haganah. Then you had this other group, Jabotinsky, the revisionists, people like, Menachem Begin were there. And they had this other group that they called Lachi, or the Irgun. And they were also a paramilitary, and they differed in one, should you ever go on the offensive? So the Haganah was explicitly willing to work with the British. The Irgun wanted to commit acts of terror against the British to force them out, right? So they bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem and killed a bunch of people. And they also differed in what the best way to protect Jews against Arab riots. There was a huge set of Arab riots between 1936 and 39, and this is when the split really happens. And so the Irgun's tactic, right, which is very Jabotinsky-esque, is you got to fight back, right? The best defense is a good offense. The Haganah said, no, we're not fighting back. Our goal was, defense. And so this comes to a headway. The most interesting episode that happened sometime in the 40s, I'm forgetting the year, but the British passed very strict white papers, and they controlled immigration very carefully, and also weapons coming in for the Zionist movement. And the Zionist movement was in a little bit of a crisis because they had a dearth of weapons, especially leading up to what they imagined was going to be a big war. So there was a big ship that was coming in with weapons. I'm forgetting from which country. It was called the Altalina. And it was staffed by a couple of Irgun soldiers, and the Irgun and Haganah, right? So we're both Yitzhak Rabin and Menachem Begin, right? They were both their representative. Menachem Begin was the head of the Irgun, and Yitzhak Rabin was the head of the Haganah. And they were both on the shores of Jaffa, watching the ship come in. And Rabin is essentially telling the ship to turn around, and Menachem Begin saying, no, come in. And Rabin gives the orders to fire on the ship, and the ship is sunk, and I think a couple of the soldiers were killed, and almost a civil war broke out. And I think it was Menachem Begin who essentially said, don't fight them. And then, of course, the funny thing is, 4 years later, these armies both merge into the IDF. So a lot of the murkiness also, right? This is also, I think, an interesting tidbit of Israeli history of what happened in 1948, and, what did Israel actually try to do, and what did the IDF do? And, there's all sorts of fascinating historic questions of whether, were there cases of, forcibly expelling Arabs from certain cities in 1948 and everything like that. And so a lot of the confusion of like a top-down plan comes from the fact that there actually wasn't top-down. There were actually different militaries, right? There was also, another group called the Stern Gang, who were an even more extreme group, offshoot of Irgun. So there were all these different groups that were all they had different commanders, right, for this war. So there were some who viewed it to be their explicit mission to say, we want to conquer this area. We need to get everybody who's not Jewish, right? We need to get all the Arabs out. And then there were other people saying like, no, that's not what we're doing in this war. And so that's also, right, Benny Morris is probably the most, right, he's written, these massive tomes of trying to uncover all of this.
Daniel,
Yeah.
British, if the Israelis had guns, they wouldn't give them ammunition. So they were in effect defenseless. So there was a lot going on at the time when they were trying to just protect themselves.
Yeah, 100%. And the Zionists, everybody ended up being upset at the British. Is actually one of the funny things is like during the encampment on campus, whenever I'd be talking to somebody who had a keffiyeh and everything, and whenever you needed to like break the ice, I was saying, well, at least we can both say that the British really messed up, and that everybody's like, yeah, yes, the British really. So at some point, nobody liked the British because the British promised Palestine to both Jews and Arabs, right? They had the Balfour Declaration right after World War I, and then later on, they essentially, told the Arab leaders, no, don't worry, this is going to be your land, and they never really stuck around to try to make it happen. And then when the Holocaust happened, they put in increasingly strict white papers stopping immigration. And then they finally come out with the Peel Commission in the late 30s, but by then it was already too late because nobody really trusted them. And so then, they just kind of left after World War II. And punted to the UN. So nobody really likes the British here. But there was a serious debate about, do you try to deal with, I mean, it's kind of the same debate you have in the Jewish community today, right? There are people in the Jewish community who say, if there are institutions like, say, college campuses, I think this is an interesting one, right? What's the best way to fight anti-Semitism on campus? Is it to tear down the institution, or is it to work within an institution, right? So the Haganah, they weren't thrilled with what the British were doing, but they were saying, well, we gotta, go to meetings, and we gotta set up, we gotta lobby the government. And they had people back in England that were, trying to fight this also, right? Britain was also obviously at war with the Nazis. So there's the famous line, I think from Rabin, we have to fight the white papers as if the Nazis don't exist, and fight the Nazis as if the British don't exist, right? So there was all sorts of confounding variables. And Leahy essentially said, no, the British are the enemies, right? We, can't think of anything else but getting the British out of here as fast as possible. And that was their view. And so, it is a very interesting debate, I think, on this matter. All right. If there are no more questions, the one other, I think, interesting thing that I'll just throw out there is the even more extreme offshoot of the Irgun, which was led by a guy named Avraham Stern. He sort of becomes infamous because he's actually to himself with the Nazis in 1940, and essentially, told the Nazis, hey, we have this, group of men that are willing to join your fight against the British if you transport Jews to Palestine and you help us fight the British, encroachment in this land. So that was obviously, a fringe extreme, but that was, in the full range of positions that people had. You can look up the Stern Gang and Avraham Stern and everything there. So it is very interesting. I like that, Kim. Mark asked, how would religious Zionists who would not tolerate a swap of land for peace react to the persecution of Zionist settlers who might become vulnerable to jihadists after the future establishment of a new independent Palestinian state? I don't know what would, I honestly have no idea what would happen if a two-state solution was ever actually on the table in terms of how Israel would actually accomplish getting settlers out of the settlements. I'm not too bullish on that. I think it's assumed that if there was a Palestinian state, there would be no Jews living in it. At least that's been Israel's assumption in every negotiation of a two-state solution, is that it's not that there would now be a Palestinian state with Jews and everything like that. So I think, just to answer your question there, but again, it's one of the reasons why this is such a pipe dream in some extent of, the two-state solution just seems so difficult, once you actually look at a map and look at where people are living. And so then you get crazy things like, Trump's proposal in 2018, which is you have lines and underground corridors and, and it's fun. People ridiculed that map, but that map makes a lot of sense based off of population centers and the geography. It just shows you how ridiculous the equation is to actually get all this done, because of the history there. So yeah.
Professor Levine, I had one question about the law of return,
Sure.
or I guess not just the law of return, but I guess the Supreme Court cases in general. I found it interesting that in the law of return, Ben Gurion, when kind of opening up about it, almost describes it as inalienable rights, as we would describe it here in America, right? Which is that these rights pre-exist, the state, and they're sort of endowed by a creator or a god. So I just found that super interesting. But my question is, it pertains to let me see what case it was. It was the Brother Daniel case, yeah. And I could be coming at this from a purely American, I guess, ethnocentric point of view, but was there any case law? Do you know if there was any case law that this case specifically was based off of, or what? Is it halakha, or is it any sort of pre-existing case law in Israel, or did they
No,
just
so
kind of make it up?
that's kind of the point in some way, right? It's definitely not halacha, because halacha would say he's Jewish. There was no real existing legal system. I mean, this is also interesting. The legal system in early Israel was a mix of three things. It was a mix of British law that just kind of carried over, a mix of what's called Mishpat Ivri, which was a movement to secularize Jewish law, right? So this would kind of be an example of that. And then just kind of like new laws that were not based on anything. Israel still to this day has no constitution. And so one of the big public controversies in Israel throughout its history has been the role of the judiciary to actually, the Supreme Court, of what are they actually basing their laws off of. And so the biggest, protest movement in Israel, this is pre-October 7th, was about this new judicial reform bill that would essentially gut the power of the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court for the last 20 years, Israel's moved politically to the right in the last 20 or 30 years as a result of both immigration and the Second Intifada and just a series of other, reasons. And so as a result, obviously the legislature has moved more to the right. Israel only has two division of powers, right? So America, we have president, Congress, and Supreme Court. Israel only has the legislature and the judiciary, because in Israel, whichever party gets the most votes, they are both the prime minister and Congress, right? And the majority in Congress. So Israel already has like a weaker division of powers than America. And so it's this, age-old question of, do you want a democracy or a liberal democracy? In other words, if the people of Israel vote, right, there's been a lot of very high-profile cases where you have, let's say this was like a flashpoint a couple years ago, an IDF soldier that was credibly accused of brutalizing a Palestinian who was in detainee, and the majority of the country, right, who's very pro-IDF, and this Palestinian detainee, right, he had a record of terrorism. They were like, well, who cares, right? This guy, committed acts of terrorism, and who cares that an Israeli soldier or Israeli, jail guard brutalized him? Like, so what? This guy was a terrible person. The judiciary came in and essentially said, well, that's not really how laws work, right? This Israeli soldier needs to get punished, right? And this case happens a lot, right? There was another case of a terrorist who was then put in handcuffs, so he was, no longer a lethal threat, and then an IDF soldier came and just shot him point blank, right? Another flashpoint of the majority of the legislature and Israeli public opinion was, okay, maybe it's not great, but like, of course the IDF soldier shouldn't be punished for this. And then the Supreme Court said, like, no, this is the law. But the complaint that the Supreme Court was getting was that, well, you're not basing this off anything, right? You're basing this off of the Declaration of Independence, which is, just very flowery and vague, right? No, that is how the Supreme Court legislates, off the, the sort of ethos of the Declaration of Independence. And then every couple of years, the Supreme Court passes what they call the basic law. But basic laws can be overturned by a future Supreme Court if, they don't even need a mega majority. They just need to vote it out. And the Supreme Court is not elected. They are picked by a group of people, right? And so you can understand the frustration, right? And both sides kind of have a point, right? The right wing is essentially saying, well, there's this like vague group of elites that are, controlling our law, and they're suppressing popular vote. And so we need to reform this. And the bill to reform the judiciary was essentially gutting all the power of the judiciary. The judiciary, one of the powers that the Supreme Court has, and I kid you not, it's called the reasonableness clause, which is if the Knesset or the legislature passes a law, if the Supreme Court finds it unreasonable, they can gut it. So again, right, you're dealing with, highly subjective, right, ideas. And so most of the time, if you're liberal, you like the Supreme Court's reasonableness clause because you find them more reasonable than the Israeli government. Obviously, if you're voting for the Israeli government, that a group of people that unelected can say your law is not reasonable. At least in America, we have to, it's based on the Constitution. I'm going to put scare quotes for a second, but at least like you have to say, oh, you're reading the 14th Amendment wrong or right, or, whatever. You at least, it's based on something that everybody recognizes as authoritative. So the people that are anti-Supreme Court, right, have a good point, and the Supreme Court people have a good point, which essentially the country wouldn't be a liberal democracy if there's just majority rules, right? There would just be no protections for minorities, or be no protections for non-Jews, no protection for, as the country becomes more religious, few protections for non-Orthodox Jews, and for, so it's a huge fight in Israel. I mean, there were actually op-eds in Israeli society the summer before October 7th that said, like, Israel's on the brink of a civil war, because there were like every single night there was, hundreds of thousands of people protesting on both sides of this. And so it was a huge question. And, it probably will come back into Israeli popular consciousness at some point when, the memories of October 7th or the war starts to dampen down. So it's a really interesting question. I don't even remember what your original question was, but hopefully that answered it in some way.
Thank you, Daniel.
Of course. Well, I'm going to let everybody, go and hang out and eat some dinner. But this was super interesting. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun for me. So
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Levine.
Thank you.